School lunches in our country started out a lot like soup kitchens, with charity organizations and parents contributing to the production of school meals for their kids. One of the developments in the school lunch program came actually from the surpluses that were created after the end of World War I. The farmers needed financial assistance. When FDR came into office and began his New Deal, one of the first things he did was the Agricultural Adjustment Act. With good intentions, they purchased the surplus food from the farmers and destroyed it, even though there were people in the country that desperately needed food. They quickly realized a better solution would be to save this food they had purchased from the farmers and create a commodity system and use this food to feed the school children. So really, this was a win-win situation. The government was purchasing excess food and their school children needed food. So it seemed perfectly logical to take those commodities and serve them to the school kids without having to buy additional food. Once World War II began, these commodities began to be sent overseas. With the end of the war, it was still obvious that America's school children needed additional nutrition and food provided at school. So President Truman signed the National School Lunch Act, which started the National School Lunch Program. And this enabled reimbursement to schools who offered meals that met the guidelines that the government had set up. It also provided funding for equipment and eventually, through amendments, made it so schools could be reimbursed for the number of lunches that they served rather than a standard rate for every school. Ever resourceful Americans decided to use the nitrogen that had been used for making bombs during the war to create chemical fertilizers. And this was a boom to agricultural practices. And we began to see, again, surpluses and excesses of wheat and corn. And suddenly our market was filled with fast junk food that had very little nutritional value. When President Reagan came into office, he reduced funding for the school lunch program. Ketchup became a vegetable, and schools had to find ways to save money. With the advent of food science and the surplus of potatoes and corn, they started serving the kids empty calories. Obesity rates have risen, and in an effort to revamp the school lunch program, Obama signed the Healthy Hunger-Free Kids Act of 2010. I see the main problem with our school lunch program policies to be that the USDA has a conflict of interest. They are responsible for designing the nutritional guidelines for kids, and yet they're also bound to agribusiness, who have their own interests, primarily financial. One of the most visible examples of how this conflict of interest with the USDA plays out is the fact that today our nation faces problems with obesity and type 2 diabetes rather than malnutrition, and yet our food policies, such as the Farm Bill, which is governed by the USDA, supports massive industrial farms who are producing a surplus of cheap calories that are not nutritious, and these come at a cost to our health and environment. Through my research and understanding of our food policies, I'm proposing 4 different potential alternatives. One is that we could amend the Farm Bill so that USDA is not overseeing the National School Lunch Program and agribusiness. Another option is to make sure we're using independently funded research to guide the USDA National School Lunch Program food guidelines that create that My Plate. A third option is to amend the Farm Bill to provide subsidies to organic farmers creating organic commodities. And the fourth option is to create a brand new national food policy that is much more holistic in its coverage. In analyzing these different options, I felt that all 4 were somewhat equal in terms of efficacy, cost, and equity, and administrative feasibility. They would all be very difficult to implement in terms of administration. Equity, they all were somewhat more equitable in terms of allowing smaller farmers to enter the market and leveling out the influence that agribusiness lobbyists have. I didn't see many more additional costs except for potential restructuring of administration and profit loss to certain industrial farming complexes. Efficacy, however, was perhaps the one area that I saw the most important difference and which guided me in my final recommendation. I would say 3 of these 4 options were effective, but on a much smaller scope, whereas our 4th option really addressed all the problems at a long-term level. A brand new all-encompassing national food policy is my recommendation, and this stems from an article written by Bittman, Pollan, Salvador, and Shooter. And they outline a number of recommendations for this national food policy. They have production recommendations, marketplace recommendations, cultural recommendations, and administrative recommendations. But overall, what it seeks to accomplish is to connect these different aspects of our society and environment that a food policy is affected by or has impact on. So with this national food policy, we'd have a healthier population, a reduction in hunger, mitigation of and adaptation to climate change with different farming techniques promoted, decreases in energy consumption, improved environmental conservation, rural and inner city development, economic development, a reduction in socioeconomic inequality, a safer and more secure food system, and savings to the federal budget, especially in terms of healthcare expenses, because in the end, this policy would result in more healthy eating and a healthier environment. It was really difficult to narrow down this assignment to one specific food policy, as I found that there is a lot of legislation that has to do with the food we end up eating. We have farm bills, we have nutrition acts, we have school lunch programs, and they all work together and impact each other. And I guess that is perhaps the takeaway, is how interconnected all of this is. And really, if we do our due diligence and look out beyond just that immediate plate of food in front of us and recognize the connections that that has to our larger environment and world and economy, this national food policy really makes a lot of sense. And so with that, I just wanted to close with a quote from Joel Salatin, who is a farming advocate and very vocal about local and organic and sustainable farming. And his words are, "This magical, marvelous food on our plate, this sustenance we absorb has a story to tell. It has a journey. It leaves a footprint. It leaves a legacy. To eat with reckless abandon, without conscience, without knowledge, folks, this ain't normal."